The fastest way to discover a person's true character is not to watch how they treat the powerful, but to watch how they treat the people quietly serving everyone else. The emergency department at St. Gabriel Medical Center had barely slowed since sunrise. Monitors chimed steadily behind closed doors, stretchers rolled through brightly lit corridors, and nurses moved with practiced urgency between examination rooms while families waited anxiously for updates. Every minute mattered. Every decision carried weight. Among the experienced medical staff was Naomi Carter, a 31-year-old black nurse whose calm presence had become a source of comfort for patients facing some of the most difficult days of their lives. Wearing neatly pressed navy blue scrubs with her identification badge clipped carefully above her heart, Naomi greeted every patient with the same reassuring smile regardless of their background, insurance, or social status. She believed every person deserved dignity the moment they entered a hospital. That belief guided every decision she made. On that particular morning, an elderly man arrived struggling to breathe. Naomi immediately followed emergency triage procedures, placing him ahead of several less urgent cases while quietly coordinating with the physicians and respiratory therapists. At almost the same moment, a luxury vehicle stopped outside the hospital entrance. A wealthy donor and longtime supporter of the hospital had arrived unexpectedly for a scheduled executive tour. Within seconds, administrators hurried through the lobby preparing to welcome their distinguished guest. Standing among them was Richard Collins, the hospital's chief executive officer, a man respected for expanding the medical center into one of the city's finest healthcare institutions. He demanded excellence from every department and expected his staff to execute every plan without hesitation. As Richard entered the emergency department accompanied by board members and senior administrators, he noticed the donor waiting near the reception desk without immediate attention. His expression hardened. Looking across the busy hallway, he saw Naomi assisting the elderly patient instead of greeting the important visitor. Without asking a single question about the medical situation unfolding before him, Richard walked directly toward Naomi. The conversations around the nurses' station faded almost instantly. Physicians paused in the middle of reviewing charts. Reception staff lowered their eyes. Patients waiting nearby sensed the sudden tension. Richard stopped only a few feet from Naomi and spoke in a voice loud enough for the surrounding hallway to hear. He questioned her priorities, criticized her professionalism, and suggested she had embarrassed the hospital by failing to recognize an important guest. Naomi listened quietly while continuing to monitor the elderly patient's breathing. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. When Richard finally finished speaking, she answered with calm respect. "Sir, this patient required immediate medical attention according to our emergency protocols. He was following hospital policy to protect his health." Her words were steady, sincere, and completely professional. Yet Richard simply shook his head before instructing another employee to welcome the donor and reminding everyone that the hospital's reputation depended on exceptional service. Then he turned and walked away with the executive group following behind him. Silence lingered in the hallway long after he disappeared. Several co-workers looked toward Naomi with sympathy, but none dared speak. Naomi took one slow breath, offered the frightened elderly patient another reassuring smile, and gently adjusted his oxygen mask before continuing her work exactly as she always had. She had no idea that within the next 24 hours, someone would walk through those same hospital doors asking for only one person, and the quiet hallway where she had just been publicly criticized would become the place where everyone finally discovered who she truly was. The hallway slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, but the quiet after the confrontation felt heavier than the constant sound of medical equipment and hurried footsteps. Naomi did not allow herself time to dwell on what had happened. The elderly patient she had admitted only minutes earlier needed another breathing assessment, laboratory samples had just arrived from another emergency room, and a frightened little boy waited nearby with his mother after falling from his bicycle. Every patient deserved her complete attention, regardless of what had happened only moments before. She gently reassured the elderly gentleman that his oxygen level was improving before walking toward the pediatric examination room with the same calm smile that had comforted hundreds of families throughout her career. Several nurses exchanged sympathetic glances as Naomi passed their station. One younger nurse quietly whispered, "You did the right thing." Naomi simply smiled and answered, "The patient always comes first." There was no frustration in her voice. There was no bitterness. She believed those words too deeply to let public embarrassment change them. A few minutes later, the wealthy donor finally entered the emergency department accompanied by hospital administrators. To everyone's surprise, the donor immediately noticed the organized medical team working efficiently around critically ill patients. Rather than appearing offended by the delayed greeting, he quietly remarked that seeing nurses place patients before formal introductions gave him greater confidence in the hospital than any executive presentation ever could. Richard heard the comment, nodded politely, and continued leading the tour without responding. Naomi never heard those words because she was helping a respiratory therapist stabilize another patient in a neighboring room. The remainder of her 12-hour shift unfolded exactly as so many others had before. She comforted anxious families waiting outside intensive care rooms. She patiently explained discharge instructions to elderly couples who worried about remembering new medications. She celebrated with a father whose daughter finally smiled after receiving treatment. She quietly covered part of another nurse's responsibilities when an unexpected emergency required extra hands. None of those small acts appeared in official reports. None earned applause. They simply reflected the professional standards Naomi carried into every shift. Late that evening, after changing out of her navy scrubs, she walked through the employee parking lot beneath soft streetlights carrying a worn canvas bag filled with nursing textbooks, handwritten notes, and a reusable water bottle. Before driving home, she paused to read a folded thank you card tucked inside the bag. Months earlier, an elderly patient had written that her kindness had helped him recover as much as the medicine itself. Whenever difficult days arrived, Naomi reread that short letter to remind herself why she had chosen nursing in the first place. She smiled gently, placed the note back inside the bag, and drove home through the quiet Chicago streets. At the sunrise the following morning, she returned for another shift as though nothing unusual had happened. She greeted security officers by name, thanked the overnight housekeeping staff for their hard work, and walked toward the emergency department carrying fresh coffee for a co-worker who had worked through the night. She never imagined that several miles away, a line of black luxury vehicles had already begun moving toward the hospital. Inside the lead vehicle sat Adrian Brooks, a 45-year-old Korean Mafia boss whose calm expression revealed nothing about his purpose. He was not coming to meet executives, attend a fundraising event, or discuss business. The only name written on the small card resting beside him was Nurse Naomi Carter, and before another hour passed, that single name would quietly change the atmosphere of the entire hospital. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center as another demanding day unfolded inside the emergency department. Naomi moved through the busy corridors with the same quiet focus she carried every shift, never allowing the previous day's public criticism to affect the care she gave her patients. She checked medication schedules, reassured anxious families, updated physicians with careful observations, and paused whenever someone needed an extra moment of encouragement. To those around her, she seemed unchanged, yet several co-workers noticed the unusual silence that followed her whenever administrators walked past. No one mentioned the confrontation from the day before, but everyone remembered it. Even so, Naomi refused to let embarrassment become the loudest voice in her day. She believed every patient deserved a nurse who arrived with compassion instead of wounded pride. Mid-morning brought another wave of emergency admissions. An exhausted construction worker suffering from dehydration thanked Naomi for explaining every step of his treatment before a physician even entered the room. An elderly woman squeezed Naomi's hand after receiving difficult test results, whispering that her calm voice made the frightening news easier to face. A frightened teenager waiting for stitches finally relaxed after Naomi joked gently about collecting a story to tell friends rather than another scar to fear. These moments never appeared on performance reports, yet they quietly shaped lives every single day. Upstairs, Richard Collins attended another executive planning meeting focused on expansion projects, donor relationships, and financial projections. Hospital leaders discussed numbers, strategic goals, and future investments while the emergency department continued caring for people whose lives could not wait for meetings to end. Richard remained confident in his leadership decisions, believing discipline and efficiency protected the institution's reputation above all else. Meanwhile, outside the hospital entrance, a convoy of polished black luxury vehicles rolled slowly beneath the covered drop-off area. Security personnel instinctively straightened their posture as the lead vehicle came to a smooth stop. Adrian Brooks stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his composed expression revealing neither urgency nor emotion. His presence immediately attracted quiet attention from staff members passing through the lobby. Hospital security respectfully approached to welcome him, assuming he had arrived for a scheduled meeting with the senior executives. Adrian acknowledged them politely before asking one calm question. "Could someone please tell me where I can find Nurse Naomi Carter?" The security supervisor hesitated for a brief moment, surprised that such an influential visitor had not requested the chief executive officer or a member of the hospital board. Within minutes, word quietly traveled through reception desks, nursing stations, and administrative offices. Richard Collins received an unexpected message informing him that Adrian Brooks had entered the building. Confident that such an important visitor must be there to discuss philanthropy or future partnerships, Richard immediately left the conference room with several executives following behind him. He adjusted his jacket while rehearsing a formal welcome in his mind. Yet when he reached the hospital lobby, Adrian walked directly past the waiting executives without slowing his pace. His attention remained fixed on only one objective. Looking calmly toward the nearest nurse's station, he repeated the same question with respectful certainty. "I am looking for Nurse Naomi Carter." The surrounding conversation stopped almost instantly. Receptionists paused in the middle of answering telephones. Physicians looked up from patient charts. Nurses exchanged puzzled glances. Richard stood silently, realizing for the first time that the most important visitor to enter his hospital that year had come for someone he had publicly criticized only 24 hours earlier. For several long seconds, no one moved. The busy hospital lobby, usually filled with the constant rhythm of conversations, rolling wheelchairs, and ringing telephones, seemed to fall into complete silence. Richard Collins stepped forward with a practiced smile, extending his hand toward Adrian with the confidence of a chief executive welcoming an influential visitor. "Mr. Brooks," he said warmly, "it is an honor to welcome you to St. Gabriel Medical Center. We would be delighted to show you our new facilities and discuss how we might work together in the future." Adrian acknowledged the greeting with a polite nod but did not reach for the offered handshake. His expression remained calm, respectful, and completely focused. "Thank you," he replied quietly. "Perhaps another time. Right now, I would simply like to speak with Nurse Naomi Carter." Richard's smile faded almost imperceptibly. He glanced toward several senior administrators standing behind him, each of them equally surprised. None had expected one of the city's most respected and influential figures to ignore the executive team entirely. Adrian waited patiently without showing the slightest impatience. His request was simple, and he repeated it with the same composed tone. "Could someone please let Nurse Naomi know that Adrian Brooks is here to thank her?" The word "thank" immediately captured everyone's attention. Nurses standing behind the reception desk exchanged puzzled glances. A physician quietly lowered the patient file he had been reading. Even visitors seated in the waiting area looked toward the unusual gathering unfolding in the lobby. Richard finally turned toward the nursing supervisor. "Please locate Nurse Carter," he instructed. Only a few moments later, Naomi stepped out from the emergency department after finishing a patient update with one of the attending physicians. She still wore the same neatly pressed navy blue scrubs, her identification badge resting above her heart, and her calm expression reflected the quiet professionalism that had guided every shift she had ever worked. When she noticed Adrian standing in the lobby, she paused with visible surprise. She searched her memory, trying to understand whether they had ever met before, but no familiar moment came to mind. Adrian walked toward her with measured steps before stopping at a respectful distance. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, he offered a small, sincere bow of gratitude. "Nurse Carter," he said gently, "I have been hoping to find you." Naomi looked genuinely confused. "I am sorry," she answered politely. "Have we met before?" Adrian smiled softly. "No. But several months ago, my mother met you, and she has never forgotten your kindness." Richard felt his heartbeat quicken. The surrounding staff listened in complete silence. Adrian continued without raising his voice. "Last winter my mother was admitted here after a serious case of pneumonia. She spoke often about one nurse who stayed beside her long after every shift should have ended, not because anyone instructed her to, but because she refused to. Let an elderly woman face fear alone. She remembered your patience, your encouragement, and the way you treated every patient with equal dignity. She asked me to find you one day so she could properly thank you herself." Naomi's eyes widened as memories slowly returned. She remembered the elderly woman, her quiet courage, and the many evenings spent reassuring her during recovery. She had never known who the family was, nor had she ever asked. To Naomi, she had simply been another patient deserving compassionate care. Around the lobby, expressions of surprise gradually transformed into quiet reflection. Richard stood motionless, replaying the previous day's public criticism in his mind. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, he began to understand that the person he had judged most quickly had been quietly representing the very values his hospital claimed to uphold. Naomi stood quietly in the center of the hospital lobby, still trying to understand why such an influential man had come searching for her. Around them, nurses, physicians, receptionists, administrators, patients, and visitors remained completely silent, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Adrian looked at Naomi with sincere gratitude rather than admiration, as though he had finally found someone he had been hoping to thank for a very long time. "My mother still talks about you," he said gently. "She tells everyone that medicine helped her recover, but compassion gave her the strength to believe she would recover." Naomi lowered her eyes with a quiet humility. "I only did my job," she answered softly. Adrian smiled. "That is exactly what she expected you would say." He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored charcoal jacket and carefully removed a folded handwritten letter. The paper had been opened and closed many times, its edges softened by months of careful handling. "She asked me to give this to you whenever I found you." Naomi accepted the letter with both hands and unfolded it carefully. The familiar handwriting immediately reminded her of the elderly woman who had spent several difficult weeks recovering from pneumonia. The letter thanked her for sitting beside her after visiting hours had ended, for explaining every medical procedure with patients, for bringing an extra blanket on a cold evening without being asked, and for speaking to her like family instead of simply another patient assigned to a hospital room. The final sentence made Naomi pause. "You reminded me that kindness is sometimes the strongest medicine in the building." Tears quietly gathered in her eyes. She remembered every moment described in the letter, yet none of those actions had ever felt extraordinary to her. They were simply the responsibilities she believed every nurse accepted the day they chose the profession. Adrian continued speaking, his calm voice carrying naturally through the silent lobby. "My mother insisted that I personally thank the nurse who never once asked who she was, what our family did, or whether we could repay her. She said you treated every patient with exactly the same dignity." Several nurses exchanged emotional glances. Some quietly smiled because they had witnessed those same small acts of compassion from Naomi countless times. Others realized they had underestimated how deeply ordinary kindness could affect another person's life. Richard Collins remained standing only a few steps away, listening to every word. The images from the previous morning replayed vividly in his mind, the crowded hallway, his sharp criticism, Naomi calmly defending an elderly patient's medical needs, and the silence that followed after he walked away. He suddenly recognized the painful contrast between the values printed on the hospital's mission statement hanging in the entrance lobby and the way he himself had treated one of the people faithfully living those values every single day. Adrian folded his hands calmly before looking toward Richard with complete respect, never raising his voice or expressing anger. "Your hospital is fortunate," he said quietly, "because people like Nurse Carter protect its reputation every hour, even when no one is watching." Those words settled heavily across the room. No accusation followed. No criticism came next. The simple truth carried more weight than any public confrontation ever could. Richard slowly lowered his eyes, realizing that the greatest lesson of his career had not come from a board meeting, a financial report, or a leadership seminar. It had arrived through the quiet example of the nurse he had failed to truly see, and everyone waiting in that lobby could sense that the next words spoken would change far more than one person's reputation. Richard remained silent for several moments, allowing Adrian's words to settle throughout the hospital lobby. The usual sounds of rolling stretchers, distant monitors, and overhead announcements seemed strangely quiet as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Naomi still held the folded letter carefully in both hands, looking down at the familiar handwriting with humble gratitude rather than pride. She had never expected recognition for doing what she believed every nurse should do. For her, compassion had never been an extraordinary act. It had simply been part of every shift. Richard slowly stepped forward until he stood only a few feet away from Naomi. His confident posture, so familiar to every employee, softened for the first time many of them had ever witnessed. He looked directly at Naomi before speaking in a calm, measured voice. "Yesterday," he began, "I judged a situation before I understood it. He allowed appearances and assumptions to speak louder than the values this hospital exists to protect." The surrounding staff listened without moving. Richard continued. "When I saw an important guest waiting, I believed our reputation was at risk. He failed to recognize that our reputation was actually being protected by a nurse who refused to compromise patient care." Naomi gently shook her head. "Sir, there is no need." Richard respectfully interrupted with a quiet sincerity. "There is every need." He turned briefly toward the physicians, nurses, therapists, reception staff, and administrators gathered around the lobby. "Leadership does not become stronger by refusing to admit mistakes. Leadership becomes stronger when it learns from them." His words carried no defensiveness, only honest reflection. Adrian remained silent, allowing the moment to belong entirely to the people who worked inside the hospital every day. Richard faced Naomi once more. "Nurse Carter, I owe you an apology. He criticized you publicly without first asking why you made your decision. You followed our emergency protocols exactly as you should have. More importantly, you protected a vulnerable patient when that patient needed you most. I am sincerely sorry." The lobby remained completely still. Naomi looked at Richard with the same calm expression she had carried throughout every difficult moment of the previous day. After a brief pause, she offered a gentle smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I accept your apology. We all have difficult days. What matters is what we learn from them." Several nurses lowered their eyes, visibly moved by the grace with which she accepted his words. A physician standing nearby nodded thoughtfully, recognizing that forgiveness often required as much courage as admitting fault. Adrian finally spoke again, his voice steady and respectful. "My mother often says that character is revealed twice. First when we make a mistake, and second when we decide what to do afterward." Richard slowly nodded, understanding the meaning immediately. Looking around the lobby, he noticed employees who had devoted years of their lives to caring for strangers, often without recognition. He realized that many of them quietly demonstrated extraordinary compassion every single day while leadership focused primarily on statistics, budgets, and public image. In that moment, Richard understood that a hospital could purchase advanced equipment, construct beautiful buildings, and attract generous donors, but its true reputation would always rest in the hands of people like Naomi. As the silence gradually gave way to quiet conversations, the atmosphere throughout the lobby felt noticeably different. Respect was no longer flowing only from authority toward employees. It was flowing toward the quiet nurse who had reminded everyone what authentic leadership, compassion, and professional integrity truly looked like, and although the morning had already changed the hospital forever, Adrian had one final decision waiting that would ensure Naomi's example would never be forgotten. The conversations that slowly returned throughout the hospital sounded different now, softer and more thoughtful than before. Employees who had walked the same hallways together for years suddenly looked at one another with renewed appreciation, as though they had all witnessed something far more important than a routine executive visit. Naomi quietly folded the handwritten letter and slipped it carefully into the pocket of her navy blue scrub top, intending to protect it the same way she protected every handwritten thank you note she had received from patients over the years. She still seemed almost uncomfortable being the center of so much attention. Adrian noticed her humility and smiled gently. My mother also asked me to deliver one more message, he said. Naomi looked up with a quiet curiosity. She told me that if I ever found you, I should not simply thank you in private. She believed people who quietly serve others deserve to be recognized where others can learn from their example. Richard listened closely, realizing the lesson was still unfolding. Adrian slowly turned toward the gathered physicians, nurses, therapists, administrators, volunteers, and support staff filling the lobby. Every hospital has impressive buildings, he said calmly. Every hospital invests in technology. Every hospital publishes mission statements. But none of those things comfort a frightened patient at 2 o'clock in the morning. People do. His words echoed naturally through the spacious entrance hall. My mother survived because skilled professionals treated her illness. She recovered with hope because one nurse reminded her that she was never facing that illness alone. Several employees quietly nodded. Some remembered seeing Naomi sit beside anxious patients long after paperwork had been completed. Others remembered watching her patiently explain medications to elderly couples until every question had been answered. None of those moments had ever been requested by supervisors. They had simply reflected the person Naomi chose to be. Adrian reached into his briefcase and carefully removed a leather folder bearing the emblem of his family's charitable foundation. He handed it respectfully to Richard instead of Naomi. I would like to make a donation to your hospital, he said. Richard accepted the folder with a visible surprise. Adrian continued before anyone could speak. However, this contribution has one purpose. He would like it used to establish an annual Compassion in Care Award recognizing nurses, physicians, therapists, technicians, and support staff whose kindness changes lives beyond medical treatment alone. A quiet wave of emotion spread through the lobby. Richard slowly opened the folder and realized the donation would fully fund the program for many years. Looking back toward Adrian, he understood this generous gift was not about publicity or influence. It was an investment in preserving the very qualities that had first inspired Naomi to become a nurse. Adrian then turned toward Naomi once again. My mother asked me for only one promise, he said. She hoped that your kindness would encourage others to continue choosing compassion even on the hardest days. Naomi smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and humility. That promise belongs to every person who works here, she answered softly. No one changes lives alone. Those simple words settled over everyone listening. Richard realized the hospital had just received something even more valuable than a remarkable donation. It had been given a new standard for leadership, one measured not only by financial success or institutional prestige, but by the quiet humanity shown in ordinary moments. As employees gradually returned to their responsibilities, many carried that lesson with them into patient rooms, waiting areas, and treatment halls, unaware that the greatest transformation was only beginning because true culture does not change through policies alone. It changes when one person's example quietly inspires hundreds of others to become just a little more compassionate every single day. The days that followed quietly transformed St. Gabriel Medical Center in ways no strategic planning meeting had ever accomplished. The donation established through Adrian's Family Foundation quickly became more than a financial contribution. It became a daily reminder that every patient deserved exceptional medical care delivered with genuine compassion. Richard personally invited representatives from every department to participate in designing the new Compassion in Care Award, insisting that physicians, nurses, therapists, technicians, receptionists, environmental services staff, and volunteers all deserved equal opportunity to be recognized for extraordinary kindness. During those meetings, Richard spoke less than he usually had in the past. Instead of directing every discussion, he listened. He asked employees what had inspired them to enter healthcare in the first place. Many shared stories they had never told before. A respiratory therapist recalled comforting a frightened child before surgery. A housekeeper described quietly sitting with lonely patients who had no family visitors. A receptionist remembered learning enough sign language to welcome hearing-impaired patients more warmly. Each story revealed that the hospital had always possessed remarkable people. They had simply needed someone to notice them. Naomi continued working exactly as she always had. She declined every suggestion that she should move into administration or seek public recognition. She preferred caring for patients one room at a time, believing the greatest privilege of nursing was earning a stranger's trust during moments of fear. Whenever co-workers congratulated her, she gently redirected the conversation toward the entire medical team. No patient recovers because of one person, she often reminded them. Healing is always shared. And humility inspired even greater respect among those around her. Several younger nurses quietly began adopting small habits they had learned simply by observing Naomi. They took a few extra minutes to explain complicated procedures more patiently. They learned patients' preferred names before entering rooms. They remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and favorite books during long hospital stays. Compassion slowly became visible not through grand gestures but through hundreds of thoughtful moments repeated every single day. Richard noticed those changes as he walked through the hospital in the weeks that followed. Employees smiled more naturally. Patients expressed greater confidence. Families wrote heartfelt letters praising not only excellent treatment but also the kindness they experienced from everyone they encountered. During one executive meeting, Richard removed several presentation slides focused entirely on financial growth. In their place, he displayed handwritten notes from grateful patients. Looking around the conference table, he quietly said, "These are the reports that matter most because they measure something no balance sheet ever can." No one disagreed. One afternoon, while finishing another demanding shift, Naomi stepped into the hospital garden for a brief moment of fresh air. Flowering trees swayed gently in the summer breeze, and sunlight reflected softly across a small fountain near the walking path. She noticed Adrian standing nearby, visiting the garden before leaving the hospital once again. He greeted her with the same quiet respect he had shown from the beginning. "My mother wanted me to ask one last question," he said with a warm smile. Naomi looked at him curiously. Adrian continued, "After everything that happened here, do you believe people truly change?" Naomi considered the question while watching two young nurses help an elderly couple walk slowly toward the entrance, offering patient encouragement with every careful step. A peaceful smile appeared across her face. "I do," she answered gently. Not because someone embarrassed them or forced them to change, but because someone reminded them who they wanted to become. Adrian followed her gaze and smiled with a quiet understanding. At that moment, both of them realized the greatest victory had never been about correcting one mistake. It had been about awakening the goodness that had always existed inside the people who chose to serve others, and that quiet awakening would continue reaching patients long after everyone involved had gone home. Autumn arrived quietly in Chicago, bringing cool mornings, golden leaves, and another season of hope to St. Gabriel Medical Center. The hospital looked much the same from the outside, yet those who walked its halls every day knew something meaningful had changed. Patients still arrived frightened, families still waited anxiously for news, and medical teams still worked tirelessly through long shifts, but there was now a gentleness woven into the rhythm of every department. New employees learned about compassion during orientation alongside clinical procedures. Experienced staff members shared stories about moments when simple kindness had transformed someone's most difficult day. The Compassion in Care Award became one of the hospital's most respected traditions, not because it carried financial recognition, but because it celebrated the quiet acts that often went unnoticed. Richard Collins attended every ceremony personally. Rather than delivering long executive speeches, he preferred inviting former patients to speak about the caregivers who had changed their lives through patience, encouragement, and dignity. Each story reminded everyone that healthcare was ultimately about people rather than buildings or titles. Naomi never expected to receive the first award established in her honor, yet when employees anonymously selected the inaugural recipient, her name appeared on nearly every nomination. She accepted the recognition with the same humility that had defined her entire career. Standing before colleagues, physicians, therapists, volunteers, and support staff, she simply thanked every member of the hospital family for carrying one another through difficult days. She reminded everyone that compassion grows strongest when it is shared rather than celebrated. Her brief words received a standing ovation, not because they were dramatic, but because they reflected the life she quietly lived every day. Months later, Adrian returned to the hospital with his mother for a routine wellness visit. The elderly woman walked comfortably beside her son, healthier than she had been in years, smiling warmly as familiar staff members greeted her throughout the lobby. When she saw Naomi across the hallway speaking gently with an anxious family, she stopped without interrupting. She simply watched for a few peaceful moments before whispering to Adrian, "She is still exactly the same." Adrian smiled softly. "That is why people trust her." Before leaving, his mother approached Naomi and embraced her with heartfelt gratitude. There were no photographers, no reporters, and no formal ceremony waiting nearby. Only 3 people sharing a quiet moment that needed no audience. "Thank you," the elderly woman said. "Not only for helping me recover, but for helping this hospital remember its heart." Naomi squeezed her hand gently. "Your kindness changed me too," she replied. Adrian looked around the busy entrance one final time. Nurses hurried toward patient rooms, physicians discussed treatment plans, volunteers welcomed visitors, and receptionists greeted every family with genuine warmth. Nothing appeared extraordinary, yet everything felt different because respect had become part of the culture instead of merely a statement on the wall. As Adrian and his mother stepped outside beneath the clear afternoon sky, he paused before opening the car door for her. Looking back through the hospital's glass entrance, he saw Naomi kneel beside a frightened young child waiting for treatment, offering a reassuring smile before standing to continue her work. She had not changed because recognition had found her. She had always been that person. The only difference was that others had finally learned to see what had been quietly present all along. And on that ordinary afternoon, everyone who understood the story carried home the same lasting truth: real greatness never announces itself, because the people who change the world most profoundly are often the ones who simply choose kindness every single day.